Don't wander around as if you have the right to be here." The words shot out, cold, short, and full of judgment, from the mouth of a police officer in a crowded courtroom. Selena Hayes, the woman of color, standing there unresponsive. No retort, no explanation. She simply quietly opened her leather wallet, took out a yellow card, Federal Court Judge Selena Hayes. But those who had insulted her didn't bother to look closely. They shoved, they ordered. They thought she was just a nuisance to be dismissed. 4 minutes later, the entire room fell silent, because the person they had just slapped in the face was the federal chief judge in charge of the entire Eastern District. It should have been another open and shut morning at the Chicago. The halls buzzed with hurried footsteps and murmured conversations. Defense attorneys shuffled case files under their arms. Defendants sat stiffly in metal benches, trying not to look guilty. And in courtroom 5B, something much uglier was about to unfold. Selena Hayes entered without ceremony. No robe, no entourage, just a charcoal gray suit, sensible heels, and the quiet gravity of someone who didn't need to announce herself. She was scheduled to oversee a federal review later that day, but decided to observe several local proceedings first. Anonymously, silently, the way good oversight should be done. She stepped through the swinging wooden doors just as a young black teenager, wrists cuffed, was led into the room. Selena's gaze sharpened. The boy couldn't have been older than 17. He didn't just look scared. He looked irritated, already convicted by the stares of the room long before any verdict would be read. Sophie moved instinctively toward the front bench, the one reserved for legal observers and law clerks. Before she could reach it, a uniformed white deputy stepped into her path. "So, I'm smiling. Omrid personal only beyond this point," he said. Selena showed no irritation. "I am authorized," she said evenly, holding up her ID wallet. The man didn't glance at him, didn't bother reading. He lowered his voice, tilting his head toward her like speaking to a child. "Don't walk around here like you have rights." Courtroom noise seemed to dim. Selena remained utterly still. Without a word, she opened her wallet fully, revealing a federal judicial badge engraved in gold. But he didn't see it, or chose not to, because before anyone could stop him, the deputy shoved her. A short, sharp motion, enough to knock her 2 steps back into the aisle. Gasps broke out across the benches. The judge on the bench froze. Defense attorneys dropped their pens. Selena didn't stumble, didn't fall. She steadied herself, righted her posture, and in that eerie half-silence that followed, she slid the badge into her breast pocket, adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, and simply said, "Continue." The bailiff blinked, realizing too late the magnitude of what had just happened. Someone whispered her name, Selena Hayes. Not just a judge, a federal court judge, one step below the appellate circuit, with authority that in certain jurisdictions could supersede state rulings entirely. The courtroom became a vacuum. The air sucked out. Everyone, even those who didn't fully understand the layers of jurisdictional power, understood one thing. They had just witnessed a catastrophe. Yet the supervising judge banged the gavel desperately. "Order in the court." Too late. The reporter sitting quietly in the back, who had come to cover a simple drug possession case, already had her phone recording. The public defenders, seasoned veterans of systemic slight, locked eyes with Selena, a mix of awe and fear. They had seen unfairness. They had fought uphill battles. But they had never seen the system try to physically erase someone with more authority than the very courtroom they stood in. Selena didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She calmly walked to the defense table, placed her hand on the defendant's file, the terrified teenager shackled and shaking, and said without raising her voice, "This case and this courtroom are now under federal review." A shudder went through the room. The deputy who had touched her tried to speak, But the supervising judge, pale and sweating, motioned frantically for him to stay silent. Because now the hierarchy was clear. They weren't dealing with a civilian problem. They were dealing with an existential threat to the entire courthouse's reputation, authority, and funding streams. And it was their own arrogance that had summoned it. In the hallway, minutes later, as court recessed in chaos, news vans began arriving. Not because Selena called them. Because someone, maybe the reporter, maybe a clerk horrified by what they saw, had leaked what happened. The headline began to write itself. Federal judge assaulted by deputy inside courtroom. Chicago's city attorneys would read that headline and feel their stomachs drop. The mayor's office would be on the phone within the hour. State judicial conduct boards would convene emergency meetings. Grant funding tied to compliance audits would be frozen. In 4 minutes, the slap that was meant to keep order had begun to crack the empire wide open. Selena stood at the top of the courthouse steps as the cameras clicked and whispered. She didn't speak to the reporters. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned to the teenage boy whose case she had silently come to observe, still sitting shackled in the waiting area. She said only one thing: "You walk out of here free today." And he did, not because of pity. Because the rules, the real rules, had finally been forced to apply. Not selectively, not conditionally. For him, Selena Hayes wasn't just a name on a docket anymore. It was a reckoning. The hand they tried to slap away came back holding the gavel, and with it the weight of every injustice they had ignored, finally crashing down. The first emails went out within an hour. Quiet, uncoeded, panicked. Subject lines like "urgent incident review needed" and "immediate response required" flooded inboxes from the Chicago municipal court system all the way to the governor's office. It wasn't just about a bad look anymore. It was about jurisdiction, about funding, about survival. Because when you assault a federal judge, especially one who hadn't even identified herself by title, the machinery of government doesn't just creak forward. It lowers awake, and it doesn't stop. Selena Hayes watched it happen from her temporary office at the federal courthouse, just 2 blocks away. She sat at a plain oak desk, a steaming cup of coffee untouched beside her, as she read the first wave of internal reports. And they were scrambling, trying to minimize, trying to frame it as a misunderstanding, trying to paint her reaction, or lack thereof, as confusing or unclear to the deputy involved. He smiled faintly at the phrasing. Confusing, unclear, words weaponized to shift blame without admitting fault. She'd seen it all before, in depositions, in hearing transcripts, in media statements crafted to appease. But this time, the playbook wouldn't work, because Selena wasn't filing a civil suit. She wasn't demanding apologies. She wasn't giving them a target they could outmaneuver. She was using something far more dangerous. The system itself. She opened a secure portal through the Judicial Oversight Committee's internal network. Logged report my formal incident report. Cited not just the shove, not just the verbal disrespect, but the systemic patterns surrounding the event. A courtroom culture that allowed unchecked bias, a security team trained more to police appearance than to uphold constitutional rights, a supervisory structure that failed to recognize or deliberately ignored her federal credentials. Each line she wrote wasn't an accusation. It was evidence. Meticulous, European proof. And because of her position, her report didn't just stay internal. It triggered automatic notifications to the Federal District Court's Inspector General, the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the National Judicial Conduct Board, 3 separate investigations, 3 separate oversight bodies, each legally required to pursue independent review, each capable of cutting funding, suspending officials, even filing federal charges, all without needing Selena to lift a finger once the wheels turned. She closed her laptop gently, then sat back and waited, not because she enjoyed the fallout, but because she understood the power of procedure. You don't have to shout in a system built on paper. You just have to file the right form. The devastation follows on its own. Meanwhile, back at the municipal court building, panic metastasized. Emergency meetings were called. Defense attorneys whispered to each other in elevators. City clerks deleted years of informal bypass emails, hoping to erase evidence of systemic abuses. Judges who once smirked at defendants' complaints about bias suddenly reviewed every case file with cold fear. Because they realized Selena Hayes wanted to, she could bring the entire institution down, and she wouldn't need protests. She wouldn't need media exposés. She would just need the law. The same law they had twisted for decades, turned now against them by someone who knew its architecture better than they ever would. Outside, the story spread. National news outlets picked it up. Federal judge assaulted during court visit. Civil rights organizations demand immediate action. Senators tweeted grave concern over the incident. Local politicians scrambled to distance themselves. The city attorney's office issued a carefully worded statement about deep respect for judicial independence, while behind the scenes they hired crisis management firms at quadruple overtime. None of it mattered, because the investigation had already passed beyond politics. It had passed into compliance, into federal oversight, where no amount of spin could soften the blow. Selena, meanwhile, spent her afternoon reviewing unrelated cases: child custody appeals, immigration asylum hearings. Routine work that reminded her why she fought to preserve the system, even when it failed so spectacularly. Because the answer was never to abandon justice. It was to force it to remember itself. That evening, as twilight spilled over the skyscrapers of downtown Chicago, Selena received an encrypted message on her private line. It was from a senior federal prosecutor she trusted. Simple, direct. Full investigation launched. All levels. Administrative hold on deputy and supervisory judge. City facing potential Section 1983 liability. DOJ notified. Section 1983. The statute that allowed individuals to sue the government for civil rights violations. The hammer behind the velvet glove. The procedural gavel that, once swung, couldn't be dodged, negotiated, or silenced. Selena smiled softly, not because she had won, because there were no winners in moments like this. Only survivors. Only those who had fought long enough, hard enough, to plant a flag no one could uproot. She thought of the teenage boy from that morning. The way he had looked at her when she said, "You'll walk free today." A look she would never forget. Because he hadn't just seen a judge. He had seen the system realize, for once, it had boundaries it couldn't cross. And somewhere deep inside the tangle of courtrooms, city offices, and bureaucratic hallways, the people who had once believed they could erase Selena Hayes with a shove were realizing they hadn't just provoked a woman. He had provoked an empire built of procedure, patience, and precision. And it was coming for them. By the third morning after the incident, the Chicago Municipal Court didn't smell like stale coffee and sweat anymore. It smelled like fear, real fear. The kind that moves faster than rumor, faster than press releases, faster than the tight smile politicians paste onto their faces when the cameras roll. Because this wasn't just a scandal. This was a federal procedural invasion. And it was spreading like blood through water. It started with 2 investigators, plainclothes, federal badges. They arrived just before 8 a.m., quiet and polite. They didn't storm the building. They didn't need to. They set up a temporary office in the old conference room near the clerk's station. The room no one used anymore because the air conditioning was busted. Within an hour, a dozen more arrived. Not just auditors, not just compliance officers, prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, forensic IT specialists, each carrying sealed subpoenas signed by federal judges from outside the state, carefully selected to avoid any local bias or interference. It wasn't a review. There's a reckoning. The first raid hit the courthouse's server room, an unremarkable space 2 floors down behind a locked steel door most judges didn't even know existed. The IT director, red-faced and stammering, tried to protest. It didn't matter. Federal order was absolute. Every email, every deleted message, every discretionary special note added to case files, without official procedure, or saying, "All right, the evidence, not allegations." But by noon, the panic had reached a boil. Judges canceled dockets without explanation. The defense attorneys whispered in parking garages, terrified they might be swept up in whatever skeletons were about to be unearthed. City officials scheduled emergency meetings in hotel conference rooms, away from the courthouse walls now humming with investigators' footsteps. And every one of them asked the same silent question. How much did she say? They thought they were cleaning up after a stumble, a little shove, an unfortunate misunderstanding. But what they had triggered was an excavation, a systemic unearthing of rot so deep they could no longer tell where the failures started or who was still clean. Selena Hayes watched from a distance. She didn't march through the courthouse like a conquering general. She didn't give interviews. She didn't leak internal documents. She simply sat at her federal office, quietly reading the daily summaries emailed to her by the Department of Justice Task Force. Deputy suspended without pay pending investigation. Chief judge recused from 3 high-profile cases. State Oversight Board formally notified of potential systemic bias violations. 3-year pattern of disproportionate rulings against defendants of color uncovered. Each bullet point felt less like victory and more like surgery. That's necessary, bloody, brutally honest. On the evening news, the story twisted into its next inevitable shape. Local anchor stumbled through cautious phrasing. Ongoing review of court procedures after incident involving visiting federal judge. New allegations surface regarding disparities in court security practices. But the careful wording couldn't hide the truth. Chicago's court system had been dragged into a federal spotlight, and there was no escape hatch. Not anymore. Inside the municipal court building, desperation took on new forms. An emergency committee was created to reform security practices. New training programs were hastily scheduled. The signs were printed overnight. All visitors and personnel must be treated with equal respect and professionalism. But Selena knew, and the investigators knew, these moves weren't for justice. They were for optics, for survival, for minimizing penalties when the audits finished carving up the institution like a diseased organ. By the end of the week, the first voluntary retirements began. An assistant chief judge, 2 senior deputies, a court administrator who had once boasted about keeping the riffraff moving, gone. Pension packages hurriedly approved before deeper misconduct could void them. It was like watching rats flee a sinking ship, except this ship had been rotting below the waterline for years. Selena hadn't sunk it. She had simply exposed the cracks they spent decades pretending weren't there. In the middle of it all, the teenage boy, the one whose hearings Selena had intended to observe the day she was assaulted, walked free. His case dismissed under procedural violation review. Selena read the news quietly. She allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Because while the investigations thundered through the halls of power, this was the real victory. one life not crushed, one future not erased. Late that Friday, as the city skyline bled gold and pink across Lake Michigan, Selena received another encrypted message. Shorter this time, from the DOJ task force lead. The preliminary report concludes systemic misconduct, recommended immediate federal oversight. Congratulations, Judge Hayes. You've pulled the thread. They couldn't hide the unraveling. She leaned back in her chair, looking out the window. No champagne, no celebration, only the steady, cold satisfaction of knowing they had tried to shove her out of sight. Instead, she had made their entire empire visible. And they couldn't clean it fast enough. The offers began rolling in faster than the subpoenas. First came the carefully worded letters from the mayor's office, from the state attorney general, from the Chief Justice of Illinois, all dripping with deep regret and profound respect for the integrity of the judiciary. None dared call what happened to Selena Hayes by its true name: self-discrimination, systemic rot. No, they preferred softer language, an unfortunate misunderstanding, a tragic lapse in protocol, a regrettable moment not reflective of our values. Next came the private invitations, lunches, quiet conversations over expensive meals, meetings off the record. They didn't want to fight her. They wanted to co-opt her, to roll her into a blue ribbon reform committee, to let her write a few policies, smile for a few cameras, then fade away. A trophy, proof that they weren't listening. Selena declined every single invitation, politely, lied firmly, because she understood something they never would. You don't fix a house built on sand by repainting the shutters. You bulldoze it and start over. Then came the settlements, offers of compensation, undisclosed sums, private apologies as she agreed not to pursue further action. 6 figures. 7. Money thrown at her like bandages onto a hemorrhaging wound. She didn't respond to those offers at all, because Selena Hayes hadn't filed a personal lawsuit. She hadn't sued for damages. She hadn't demanded anything for herself. She had triggered structural investigations no amount of hush money could bury once they were underway. Meanwhile, the deputy marshal who had shoved her, the man whose badge once gleamed with assumed authority, was drowning under the weight of his own consequences, suspended, facing federal civil rights charges, a criminal trial looming. He had issued a public apology through his lawyer, a trembling, scripted statement read in a monotone. I regret my actions and deeply respect the role of the judiciary in our society. Selena didn't even watch the press conference. She already knew what fear sounded like and didn't interest her. City officials scrambled to polish the badge he once wore. They plastered his past commendations across local news sites, talked about his years of service, his moments of bravery, but no amount of polish could hide the truth anymore. The badge hadn't protected the people. It had protected the system, a system that shoved black women out of sight, that silenced defendants without power, that rope rules with a smile, because it believed it would never be held accountable. Selena hadn't destroyed that system. He had forced it into the open, forced it to rot where everyone could see. As spring turned into summer, the fallout spread. Several judges resigned under early retirement programs. A security director was quietly reassigned. The mandatory training programs were announced with much fanfare, but everyone understood they were firefighting gestures. The real heat came from the Federal Oversight Board, now embedded in the court's daily operations. Every case, every discretionary action, every bar warrant, audited, documented, and still they came to her. Margoff, I once. positions on committees, nomination for state Supreme Court, senators calling her a vital voice for reform. He smiled at the irony. The same people who wouldn't have let her sit in the reserved rows 3 months ago now wanted to give her keys to the building, not because they believed she belonged, because they were afraid of what happened when she stayed outside and built a door they couldn't lock. Selena considered it all, not with bitterness, not with vanity, with precision, because power offered is not the same as power held. And she didn't want a seat at their table. She wanted new tables, built differently, built better, built without the invisible velvet ropes that had tried to push her out of Courtroom 5B that morning. On a quiet afternoon in June, she finally spoke publicly for the first time since the incident. No media circus, no grand gestures, just a simple press conference on the courthouse steps. She stepped up to the microphone, wearing the same charcoal gray suit she wore the day they tried to erase her, and said, "Justice is not about repairing reputations. It's about repairing systems. It's about remembering that badges and benches mean nothing without the consent of the people they are meant to serve. And it's about building institutions where no one, not by race, not by wealth, not by politics, can be shoved out of their own democracy." She stepped back. No questions, no sound bites, no spinning. Just truth, left to hang in the humid Chicago air like a thundercloud, waiting to break. That night, walking home through the city streets lit by warm amber lamps, Selena passed by the courthouse once again. The badge on the building's seal caught the light. But she didn't slow down. She didn't glance up, because she knew you can't polish a badge. When the rot runs through the steel itself, you have to rebuild it, or let it fall. And she was ready for both. For months after Selena Hayes stood on the courthouse steps, Chicago's legal system tried to return to normal. It failed, because once a wall cracks, once the foundations shift, you can't pretend the building is safe anymore. Either they rebuild it, or it collapses. And Selena had quietly ensured there would be no patchwork, only reconstruction. It began with the small changes. Mandatory bias training evolved into mandatory external auditing. Every 6 months, no exceptions. Then came the real reforms. Discretionary arrest holds, abolished. Anonymous case flagging based on appearance, criminalized. Independent defense observers stationed in every high-risk court. Not recommendations, requirement. Signed into state law by a nervous governor, flanked by civil rights attorneys who would have torn him apart in the next election if he hadn't. And at the bottom of every new statute was a name written into the legislative record, inspired by the judicial review actions, initiated by federal Judge Selena Hayes, a name not stamped as a trophy, stamped as a warning. The badge on the courthouse doors stayed the same. The marble statues stayed. The architecture still whispered old hierarchies. But inside, the rules had changed, and no amount of ceremony could unwrite them. Selena watched it unfold from a distance. She didn't seek award. They didn't grant interviews. When asked to attend ceremonies in her honor, she declined, politely but firmly, because the fight was never about being celebrated. It was about making complacency impossible. It was about raising the cost of injustice so high that even the most corrupt officials would think twice. Young law students began citing her case in moot court competitions. Professors built lectures around the Hayes incident, studying how a single procedural trigger cascaded into a systemic realignment. In community centers across the city, murals appeared, not of Selena's face, but of an open courthouse door painted wide against a sunrise backdrop. Up of 3 words, access without permission, because that was the legacy she had carved. a reminder that the law was never meant to belong to the gatekeepers. It was meant to belong to the people, all of them. In one of the final reports issued by the Department of Justice's Oversight Board, a key paragraph stood out. Where unchecked discretion festers, injustice is not an anomaly, it is the architecture. Systemic failures cannot be patched by apologies. They must be dismantled by those courageous enough to confront comfort with accountability. Selena underlined it quietly with a pen as she read. Not because she needed validation, because it meant the message had traveled beyond her, beyond Chicago, into every courtroom where power once moved invisibly and now stumbled under the weight of exposure. One rainy afternoon, nearly a year after that day in Courtroom 5B, Selena returned to the building. Not as an overseer, not as a plaintiff, just as an observer again. She passed through the metal detectors without incident. No guard stopped her. No clerks questioned her. She sat in the back row, watching a preliminary hearing for a case she had no stake in. A young public defender objected sharply when a deputy interrupted her argument. The judge listened, sustained the objection, chastised the deputy publicly, on the record. I think we agreed. Selena smiled almost imperceptibly, because change wasn't in the grand declarations. It was in the small corrections, the ones that built a new foundation, brick by stubborn brick. As she exited the building, the sky opened up above Chicago. Rain swept across the pavement in silver sheets. Selena paused under the courthouse awning, watching as people moved through the downpour. A young woman, a law clerk by the look of her, rushed toward the doors, bags slung over her shoulder, case files wrapped tight against her chest. She glanced up, catching Selena's eye for a brief second. Recognition flickered. Respect. No words passed between them. None were needed, because in that flash of connection both understood. The door hadn't been forced open just once. It had been unlocked for good, and no one was bending it. The rain thinned. Selena stepped into it without umbrella or hesitation. The courthouse stood behind her, unlit, unchanged in stones, transformed in spirit. The city pulsed alive. The city still scarred, still struggling, but moving forward now. Not because it wanted to, because someone had made it impossible not to.